So good afternoon, everyone. We've examined representations of transnational human trafficking in various media, including newspapers, fiction, and documentaries, and they're all English language. And our research ended up becoming an open access book shown here on the slide, and I'm happy to share the link to it in the chat afterwards. And I've contributed primarily to the newspaper analysis. And we began, of course, with an extensive literature review, mainly to determine the key aspects of transnational human trafficking reporting that we should examine, but also to determine the directions of research beyond the project at hand. And we found that, taking all existing research together, primarily those people who are female, young, and violently forced into the sex trade are successfully identified as victims in these contemporary media discourses. And this emphasis on this ideal trafficking victim can result in many real survivors not receiving appropriate support, and they are often criminalized. This narrative also distracts from the structural factors that actually put people at risk of being trafficked, such as poverty and the global demand for cheap labor. So in short, the representation of trafficking is actually a key factor in its perpetuation, we argue. So we then collected a corpus, a collection of texts of roughly 80,000 newspaper articles and created a timeline to see when the subject of human trafficking was especially heavily reported. A small sample of articles in these spikes, you can see them on that image, was manually analyzed to provide the depth that a corpus-assisted critical discourse analysis can sometimes lack. So that's our method of analysis. And as you might expect, our analysis reveals a conflation or confusion of transnational human trafficking and people smuggling in these articles. And these concepts are also blurred with those of migration and asylum seeking. Where female victims are sexualized and female victims are very much overrepresented, and both perpetrators and victims are portrayed as numerous, as illegal and non-British. So they are also the victims and perpetrators that receive the most attention. Perpetrators are generally not focused on or identified except to point them out as being organized. The law enforcement response is very much prioritized and also normalized in these discourses, with victims merely being actually kind of excuses to show off that law enforcement response. So our findings, in other words, support that prior research, suggesting that this narrative is incredibly pervasive. So we noticed that so much research on media reporting of human trafficking has focused on Anglophone media. And this has prompted us to begin examining reporting on this and similar topics in different languages and cultures. Cristiano Gregoriou has said more about one of these projects earlier today. But the thing is, why do we care that the media write about it in this way? Well, it is on the one hand important because of what we assume general audiences do with these representations, but we would need to examine those audience responses further to know for sure. And we also assume that these representations affect policy, and thankfully people are researching policy discourses as well, so we can start seeing the links between those discourse spheres. And finally, there's the question of what we can actually do to change that narrative, came up in the chat earlier as well, so that eventually we can change things like policy and public responses for the better. And I think that's a question that I can leave with you all. Thank you so much.